Night flight in bad weather. In the middle of the night at the end of March, Air Canada 624 left Toronto on a routine schedule bound for Halifax. On paper, this was just a domestic flight lasting less than 2 hours. But seasoned veterans understood. The real danger lay not in the distance, but in what was waiting for them at their destination. As the Airbus headed toward the East Coast, the weather in Halifax began to deteriorate faster than forecast. Wind from the north slammed down onto the runway, and bands of wet snow blown sideways reduced visibility to just enough to control the aircraft's direction. It was not the kind of weather any flight crew wanted to encounter at midnight that I in the aviation industry. Situations like this are common. Not severe enough to force the airport to close, but difficult enough that any margin of error could become a domino falling at the wrong time. The crew of Flight 624 understood this clearly. Halifax is not a major hub, and when weather conditions drop this low, every decision must be calculated in seconds and by every small step of the procedure. Visibility was strangled by wind and snow, making the approach path look like a narrow road stretching into infinity. On the screen, the weather indicators appeared coldly. Strong crosswinds, snow mixed with hail, and low temperatures that could coat the ground in ice at any moment. This was the kind of night where pilots had to rely entirely on procedures, unable to depend on feel or intuition. The flight continued toward Halifax, but clearly everyone knew this would not be an easy landing. The crew prepared for a complex approach where if they missed a beat, everything could deviate from the standard path. And precisely in that context, their first major decisions began to take shape. Experienced crew but complex approach. As Air Canada 624 approached Halifax, the next factor determining the risk level was no longer just the weather, but the approach structure of the runway itself. Runway 05 was not the type with full guidance like ILS, something pilots could just lock onto and let the system guide them down stably. Here, they only had the localizer, meaning they were only supported with lateral guidance, while altitude had to be calculated manually, step by step, according to standard charts. For longtime professionals, that is an approach requiring concentration bordering on the limit. Both pilots that night were deeply seasoned, each having accumulated over 11,000 flight hours. But experience could not change the reality. When having to manually control altitude amidst strong winds and reduced visibility, the approach path becomes a chain of waypoints where a deviation of just a few seconds could cause the aircraft to drop below the standard path. This is the type of work that allows for no subjective feeling, nor any room to fly by experience. Everything must cling to the charts, to the point where every step down had to match the numbers printed on the guide exactly. In the industry, anyone who has witnessed path deviations understands that a localizer approach in bad weather is like walking on a narrow bridge with wind blowing from 3 directions at once. It is not because the pilots are weak, but because the nature of the procedure is inherently harder than normal. In Halifax, Runway 05 had long been seen as a choice that must be accepted when weather renders the other runways unusable. From the cockpit, numbers flashed continuously: altitude benchmarks, remaining distance, descent rate. Everything had to mesh absolutely perfectly. And right within this complexity, Flight 624's journey began entering a phase where even a small deviation was enough to create an incident no one wanted to witness. Decision to change alternate airport to extend holding time. As the A320 continued to slide through the thick cloud layer surrounding Halifax, the biggest issue the crew faced was no longer the difficult approach or the wind whipping the fuselage. At this moment, the fuel equation truly became the main pressure on night flights into bad weather zones. Fuel is not just a number on a spreadsheet. It is a silent countdown clock ticking away by the minute. And that night, that clock began running faster than anticipated. The initial alternate airport was Montreal, a standard choice in normal conditions. But Halifax was not a normal destination on a snowy night, and the weather showed no sign of clearing. If they kept Montreal, their holding time would be limited, meaning the crew would have only a small window to attempt an approach before having to divert. With a runway only using a localizer and intermittent visibility, that window of time was too risky. Therefore, the crew switched the alternate to Moncton, which was closer, allowing them to extend the holding time around Halifax. That was a decision positioned between two pressures, both vague and clear. One side was the hope that the weather would ease up, the other was a fuel level that allowed no wasted minutes. Experience only helps pilots evaluate faster, it cannot change the reality that every choice carries its own risks. Extending the holding time sounded reasonable, but it also meant every circle flown was a step closer to the boundary of having no options left. From the moment they changed the alternate airport, Air Canada 624's journey entered a completely new chapter. They had bet on the only door still open, that Halifax would be clear enough to allow one safe approach before fuel levels forced them to leave. The single runway and unavoidable choice. From the cockpit, Halifax was no longer a normal destination. It resembled a final station trapped between thick snow and wind blasting straight from the north. And when the crew rechecked the runways, the truth appeared as clearly as a beacon at the end of the night. Runway 32 was covered in snow and completely closed. Only runway 05 remained, a single entry, but lacking a complete ILS system, meaning there were no invisible rails to guide the plane down safely in poor visibility. This was not a choice based on preference, but a choice dictated by reality. Strong winds blowing from the north forced the landing direction to be 05, even though everyone knew it was the harder path, lacking support tools and forcing the crew to rely more on experience than equipment. In this profession, sometimes it's not what you want, but what the sky forces to happen. When connecting the previous decisions, from accepting an approach in a blizzard, changing the alternate airport to buy time, to tracking every minute of fuel, choosing runway 05 was like the next step in an inseparable chain of pressure. Every choice had a reason, and that reason always stemmed from operational reality, not sentiment. Runway 05 was nothing special other than being the final option. The lights on both sides were still on, but behind that glow was an entire expanse of white oblivion. With 3 decades of experience, I know well this is the kind of night every pilot wants to avoid. But with runway 32 gone, no favorable wind, and not many minutes left to wait, the crew of Air Canada 624 had to commit to runway 05. Not because they believed it was the best choice, but because it was the only choice left open. And right here, the story shifts to the hardest part of every storm approach. When the sky leaves you only one narrow entrance, and you are forced to proceed. Altitude deviation and dangerous glide in the freezing mist. Forced to approach runway 05 on a night when the sky was shut tight like a thick curtain. The crew switched to landing in FPA mode, maintaining a -3.1 degrees angle. This is a common approach method when there is no ILS, but it demands precise observation and very tight altitude control. The problem lay here. In deep cold weather, the altimeter, the device measuring altitude via pressure, always tends to read higher than actual. This means the aircraft is actually lower than the number being displayed. In normal conditions, pilots would easily cross-check visually when nearing the runway. But that night, Halifax was submerged in thick snow and weak light, making visual observation nearly zero. When you only have a non-ILS runway plus limited visibility, a small deviation in altitude quickly turns into a large deviation in reality. And that was the crux. The crew believed they were flying the correct -3.1 degrees slope, but in reality, the A320 was sliding lower bit by bit. There were no poppy lights for guidance, no light rails to cross-check altitude. There was only white darkness and a few numbers on the control panel, numbers that did not reflect the aircraft's true position in space. When combined with previous decisions, approaching in bad weather, only one usable runway left, lack of support systems, and fuel not allowing further circling, a small error in altitude control became the breaking point of the entire chain. It all happened without noise, without drama, just an aircraft slowly sliding lower than the safety level without anyone realizing it in the aviation industry. This is called the blind spot of the cold night. When eyes cannot see, equipment is not perfectly accurate, and the reality outside the window is far different from what you read on the dials. This was the defining moment, when Air Canada 624's A320 stepped past the limit without the crew being able to realize it to correct the trajectory. Unanticipated touchdown and chain reaction in the dark. As the A320 continued to slide below the safe glide path without anyone in the cockpit realizing it in time, everything reached an irreversible point. At exactly 0:43, when they believed the nose of the plane was about to glide over the threshold of runway 05, the fuselage actually made contact with the ground much further out, 335 meters short of the runway. That was not a proper landing, it was an impact outside the protected zone, where there was no leveled surface or lighting to support any error. Immediately after impact, the aircraft swept across the area containing the underground power cables, cutting into critical power lines supplying the entire Halifax airport. In a split second, what remained of the guiding lights vanished, and the entire airport fell into a darkness as heavy as stone. For an aircraft losing trajectory control, that was like turning off all the lights in a room where you are trying to overcome an obstacle. With no landing gear left intact, the A320 slid on its belly, the fuselage plowing through snow and earth for another 335 meters. Every meter that passed added more force to the wings, the gear, and the tail, places not designed to withstand such a slide. When the plane stopped, it bore the scars of a chain of errors stretching from the sky down to the ground. In aviation, they often say, when a small deviation goes undetected, the ground will remind you with a very clear sound. That night, the ground at Halifax did exactly that. No explosion, no dramatic scene. Just a cold touchdown outside the limits. Enough to say that the chain of warnings had passed without any timely intervention. This was the moment the story shifted from technical error to actual consequence, marking the moment where all previous decisions finally revealed their full consequences. Consequences after the slide and the final picture of a chain of errors. When the A320 came to a halt in the compressed darkness of Halifax, the story did not end with the twisted metal frame. It continued with cold numbers, 23 people injured, including both pilots, but fortunately, no one lost their life. To those in the industry, these numbers are not just statistics. They are the direct result of a deviant approach path from the air, extending all the way to the ground. The aircraft severing the power cables caused the entire airport to sink into a power outage for 90 minutes. On paper, that was just an interruption. But in operational reality, 90 minutes is enough to paralyze all activity. Flights had to divert, ground crews could not see any signs, and control systems had to run on backup mode. It was a period where an international airport like Halifax, accustomed to clear procedures and consistent lighting, suddenly fell into a reluctant silence. Investigators later concluded the cause was not a single factor. Bad weather, an unsuitable approach method, and misjudging altitude in freezing conditions were the three main puzzle pieces. When put together, they created a clear picture. A chain of small errors undetected at the right time can lead to major consequences, even if the pilots maintained control and no extreme situation occurred during the approach path. Tragedy in the aviation industry does not always come from major failures or bold decisions. Sometimes it comes from choices that seem reasonable but are unsuitable for a cold night, with an incorrect approach angle, and with parameters not strictly checked. Ultimately, the incident at Halifax became a reminder that the entire industry must seriously note. In aviation, close enough is sometimes enough for everything to veer off the safe path.